everyone, and welcome back to another short video, part of a series of chats I'm having with various authors who contributed a chapter to my forthcoming edited book, A Brief History of Economic Thought from the Mercantilists to the Post-Keynesians, published by Edward Elgar. The idea came about when my co-editor, Hassan Bougrin, and I felt there was no suitable undergraduate textbooks from a critical heterodox perspective aimed for an undergraduate audience on the history of thought. But we also wanted to do something a little bit different. We wanted to do a series of videos where we would sit down with the authors and discuss the content of their chapters. Today's guest is Malcolm Sawyer, Emeritus Professor of Economics at the University of Leeds in the United Kingdom. He was the lead coordinator for the EU-funded €8 million, 15-partner, 5-year project on financialization, economy, society, and sustainable development. He was the managing editor of International Review of Applied Economics for over 30 years and has served on a range of editorial boards. He's the editor of the book series New Directions in Modern Economics for Edward Elgar as well, and co-edits with Philip Orestes the annual International Papers in Political Economy for Palgrave Macmillan. He's the author of 12 books, including The Economics of Michal Kalecki, and his most recent book is Can the Euro Survive? With Policy Press, and he is currently working on The Power of Finance, Financialization, and the Real Economy to be published by Agenda. He has edited or co-edited over 30 books. He has published over 140 papers in referee journals and contributed over 160 book chapters on a wide range of topics, including financialization, Eurozone, fiscal policies, and alternatives to austerity, money, public-private partnerships, and of course, on Kalecki and Keynes economics, which is the topic of this video today. Malcolm, welcome back. Welcome and thank you for participating in this book and for sitting down with me. I'm just going to get right to the question. Your chapter is on Polish economist Michal Kalecki, who is the subject of quite a revival in the past decade and more. He's a contemporary of Keynes. It is chapter 6 of this book and follows a chapter on Keynes. Now, it is said that Kalecki developed the core idea of effective demand before Keynes, and many people, many authors, many economists believe that he should be considered the originator of that idea. What's your opinion on that?
Well, Kalecki, of course, was born in Poland in 1899, and he was about 16 years younger than Keynes. So there was a sort of half a generation difference. And their first, 40 years of life were in rather different circumstances, comparing growing up in Poland often in degree of poverty compared to the life of Keynes. Keynes's general theory, of course, was published in 1936, and Kalecki could, I think, claim to have published some of the ideas on effective demand in papers starting in 1933. Although they received rather little attention because they initially were published in Polish and not widely read outside of that. And only, I think probably from 1935-36 onwards, when he started to publish in English to some degree, did they become recognized in outside of Poland and so forth. I think Kalecki and Keynes have very different influences upon the development of their work. Kalecki much more influenced by Marx, Keynes much more in what might be called now the neoclassical tradition. So I think we could look at it that they both had the ideas about the importance of effective demand. They both had ideas that investment was a key driver of effective demand, but took rather different views about the forces behind investment. Keynes much more on animal spirits and state of expectations. Kalecki much more on profits and capacity utilization and accelerated type of mechanisms. So although there's some similarity, there are important differences. So I'm not sure how fruitful it is to argue who was really first, and rather to celebrate two interesting sets of ideas. Kalecki wrote a review of Keynes's general theory shortly after it was published, and in that he acknowledged that Keynes had put forward some important ideas on effective demand, and he argued that those ideas were correct. And he then also pointed to the role of investment in Keynes and argued that there were certain ambiguities in Keynes's analysis. So they shared the idea of effective demand, I think, but differed over the specification and so forth of investment.
Yeah, thank you. You mentioned the Kalecki's review of the general theory, which I read only a few days ago in preparing for this chat. And I think in the opening sentence of the review, he says that the book is, a wonderful achievement. I don't have the exact words, but it's clear that he had great admiration for the book. What was the relationship, though, between the two men? Were they fond of each other?
I think there was, in some sense, a very limited relationship between them. Prior to 1936, there was effectively no interactions between them. Kalecki was aware of the work of Keynes and indeed had written some commentaries on Keynes's analysis of the, for example, the Depression. As far as we know, Keynes was totally ignorant, knew nothing of the ideas of Kalecki. And then in 1936, Kalecki, through a Rockefeller fellowship, travels firstly to Sweden to study the Swedish School of Economics. And whilst he's in Sweden, indeed discovers the publication of the general theory, and then comes to England and particularly to visit London and Cambridge and to interact with the Cambridge economists. With his particular contact and to some extent who he worked with, or at least discussed many ideas, was Joan Robinson. And it was Joan Robinson that really introduced him, I think, into that Cambridge circle. His interactions with Keynes were, to some degree, Keynes and others in Cambridge was very influential in securing a research post for Kalecki after his Rockefeller Foundation scholarship had ended, and after he had, for various reasons, decided to leave Poland. And Jan Toporowski, in his book Intellectual Biography of Kalecki, which I reference in the chapter, goes into some detail in terms of, on the one hand, the involvement of Keynes and others in securing a post for Kalecki, and to some degree the discussions that went on between them. Then there are a few other instances of interactions between Kalecki and Keynes. For example, Kalecki wrote and submitted to the Economic Journal a couple of papers, one of which was accepted and I think one of which was rejected. But in looking at the correspondence of that, you get this sense that there wasn't a great deal of often meeting of minds, and that the approaches to analysis, methodologies to some extent, assumptions made, did differ between them. And I think it would be difficult to see where Kalecki and Keynes in any sense influenced each other. They to some extent run on parallel lines, and then I think, as far as I know, their interactions ended in 1941 or thereabouts, and Kalecki went to work in Oxford on looking at the state of the world of the war economy, and also developing ideas which we'll come on to about fiscal policy and budget deficits.
It's interesting to think what could have been if they had had a closer relationship and or working relationship. So we touched a little bit on Kalecki's ideas on, and he analyzed economic systems, capitalism, central planning, developing economies, really from the 1920s in Poland until his death in 1970. What was his general vision of the nature of the capitalist economy?
I'm going to start by talking about some of his work that he was doing in the 1920s, which when he was looking at credit ratings of firms applying for loans and market research, economic and political journalism, and then looking at his first employment at a research institute, which was the study of business cycles and the preparation of reports on specific industries. And I tend to think that coming out of those studies on specific industries was his view that a capitalist economy was essentially oligopolistic or monopolistic, and there were tendencies towards monopoly and oligopoly, which may be enhanced over time. And I think to some extent that was reflected in his work on the degree of monopoly, which comes later. I think otherwise it's a view that the capitalist economy is essentially a conflictual society, conflicts between particularly labor and capital, between workers and capitalists. And so there's that always conflict in his I think in his models. He also, I think, saw, and because writing in the 1930s particularly emphasized, that capitalism tended to display unemployment. It had business cycles. It would then have crises. But there were all these elements of cyclical behavior and of unemployment as being a key characteristic of capitalism. And I think those were probably the major ones in this notion of big business, if you like, oligopoly on the one side, and on the other, the prevalence of unemployment cycles and so forth.
Yeah, we'll come back to some of these ideas in a few questions. But he also portrayed investment as a key driver of aggregate demand and the interdependence between investment and profits. What are the mechanisms at work here, and what is the significance of the investment profits nexus?
Well, there's in a way a two-way process between investment and profits. On the one side, much of the drive for investment is the drive for profits. Firms undertake investment in order to increase the capital stock, but also from that to gain profits. And they will only undertake investment if it is going to be profitable. It may also be that retained profits form a funding for future investments. So if profits go up, there are then more savings flowing through profits through the system, which then will go alongside the ability of firms to undertake the loans as well, so that those two interact. I think also under investment, there's also a strong kind of cyclical element, that one of the reasons that firms undertake investment is when they have a shortage of capacity. They're not going to invest if there's a large amount of spare capacity. Also, when profits change, and Kalecki emphasized, then firms will want to change their capital stock, and that leads to investment. So there's a kind of accelerated type of mechanism involved. But generally, the relationship is between a positive relationship between profits and expected profits and the desire to invest. Although now we might come back to argue whether in the present situation that still holds. In the other direction, Kalecki firstly emphasized that there was a difference in consumption and savings relative to wages and relative to profits. And in much of particularly his earlier work, he adopted the position of the classical savings function, that is, that workers do not save out of wages, but capitalists do save out of profits. And that to some extent reflects an essentially subsistence view of wages, because if your wages are at subsistence level, then you have to spend all of it in order to subsist, so that savings would be low or zero out of wages. Then if we take the perspective that is for a closed economy without government coming in, then there will be inequality in outcome between savings and investment. If savings is mainly out of profits, savings equal to investment will mean that there's a relationship between investment and profits. Because the direction of causation here runs from investment to savings. So it's the generation of investment leads to a generation of profits. And one of the interesting things about this is that we have a sort of micro-macro relationship here. At the level of the firm, profits influence investment, and that's a sort of a micro relationship, although we then build it up to possibly aggregate relationship. But on the other side, the relationship between savings and investment is a macro relationship. So we have this two-way relationship, one micro, one macro. Now, part of the significance of the relationship between investment and profits is that, of course, the volume of profits will then be, to some degree, set by or strongly influenced by the level of investment. So the overall volume of profits will depend upon the volume of investment. And that, I think, Kalecki saw as an important element, because then obviously the overall amount of profits, and so profits relative to the economy, would depend upon investment.
Thank you. Let's touch on another core idea of Kalecki's work, which is a degree of monopoly. Some have viewed it in terms of an approach to pricing. Is its role limited to that, or does it have a much wider, broader significance?
But the origin of the term degree of monopoly, I think, is from Abelard, and in that, and it's often, in effect, still taught in elementary micro courses, marginal revenue equals marginal costs from profit maximizing condition, and from that one derives a relationship between price, elasticity of demand, and cost. And Lerner viewed that in terms of the degree of monopoly. Now, I think Kalecki broadened that out in eventually two respects. One is to set the degree of monopoly in the context of oligopolistic behavior. So the degree of monopoly reflects the degree of market power. And so the market power depends upon not only the concentration of an industry, how far it is along that spectrum between, as it were, atomistic competition and oligopoly and monopoly, but also things like the barriers to entry, how much advertising is done, how much effort is put into limiting entry into the industry so that the existing firms can raise prices relative to costs. And in work towards the end of his life, Kalecki broadened it even further in order to view the degree of monopoly not only as the immediate market power of firms, but also their power over workers and their power in order to, in effect, reduce wages and thereby increase their profit margins thereby. And I think you can view it certainly as a pricing theory. That's how it's often taught. I think in Kalecki, there are two important elements that come out of it. One is that the share of profits in income can be related to the degree of monopoly. The share of profits then depends upon the ability, in effect, of firms to raise prices over costs, and that can be translated into the share of profits. And the other one, which I think is important for the macroeconomics, is one can derive, and it's mentioned in the chapter, what the implications are for the relationship between money wages and prices. That is the relationship that is, in fact, real product wage. And what that tends to indicate is the idea that, for example, the real wage is effectively set by firms, not in the labor market, but in the product market. It depends on what prices firms are able to extract. And it also tends to mean that there would maybe not very much variation in the real wage over the business cycle. So if unit costs are broadly constant, then one might expect that there'd be very little variation in the real product wage. So ideas that, well, wages are too high or too low and that's causing unemployment doesn't really hold in Kalecki, because we'd expect that real wages wouldn't vary very much. And if insofar as they do vary, it would be because demand is higher or lower, and that's changed unit labor costs.
Thank you. Let me switch here to another topic, which is of great interest to me, since I work in the area of money, monetary analysis. Did Kalecki contribute to money, endogenous money, or monetary analysis?
Well, of course, it's well known that Keynes wrote a great deal more about money than Kalecki. I think the role which money plays in Kalecki is we're in the background. It doesn't push it up front. And one can look back at it and say, well, yes, he was effectively an endogenous money view. That is, he indicated that, for example, if investment was to take place, then banks had to provide loans for that investment to take place, and that would then lead on to some creation of bank deposits and so forth. But he didn't go into any detailed analysis of that, and it's almost one of the things he took for granted. Though he did make the point that banks would be able to throttle off any expansion if they didn't provide the loans in order for the investment to take place. So in that sense, he did. I think he would also, and this may be reading too much into his, did make the point that government expenditure, if it's to take place, has to be financed by the creation of effectively central bank money. But again, he didn't make a great play of this. So I think it's always it's there as we're in the background. And I almost kind of wish that he'd made much more of this, because I think it's become important over the years. But perhaps it's his style that he didn't make a great deal of this.
Thank you. Final question. Kalecki portrayed capitalist economies as suffering unemployment of labor and excess capacity. Why? And what could be done about that?
Well, going back to the role of effective demand, in effect, it would be that demand was too low in order to create sufficient demand for output and thereby for employment. And in turn, in Kalecki on the whole, it's a matter that if you like, investment is too low rather than consumption. So it's the level of investment which is the driving force. So it's investment being too low. In his writings, particularly during the war, Kalecki made the point that with the discovery of these ideas of effective demand, the work of himself, of course, but perhaps more particularly that of Keynes, he used a rather optimistic phrase that everyone now agrees that unemployment can be solved, in effect, by budget deficits and demand management. It's not a precise quote, but that's the idea. What he did then go on to say was that even though the technical solution is now known, that is, run budget deficits, that doesn't mean to say it's going to be accepted. And there will be many forces, particularly from financial markets and others, which will resist the use of budget deficits in order to reach full employment. I shall say as an aside, Kalecki wrote a piece called 3 Ways to Full Employment, in which he looked at the roles of stimulating investment, redistribution of income, and budget deficits as a way of stimulating demand to reach full employment. He rather argued that there was a limit to how far investment could go, because if investment takes place, the capital stock rises, and that may lead to a reduction in the rate of profit on the capital stock. He wrote about the redistribution of income, which was redistribution to some degree from profits to wages, but also from rich to poor. And I tend to think that this was his favored solution, that a way of, on the one hand, to some degree, addressing the inequalities under capitalism, and also helping to secure a high level of employment, because that shift in the distribution of income would lead to higher demand and higher employment and lower unemployment. It's, I think, interesting to look at the reasons that Kalecki gave for doubting whether capitalism could reach full employment, even with the technical solution, in a sense, being known. And this was included, for example, the changes in the relationship between workers and capitalists, which would come about as a result of full employment. As he framed it, there would be the problems with over-discipline in the factories, that is, the power of workers would increase, so that exercise of power over the employment relationship would be undermined. And for those sort of reasons, Kalecki argued that if capitalism was to secure full employment, it would have what he later came to call fundamental reforms. That is, changes in the relationship between workers and capitalists to have relationships which would be conducive to underpinning full employment. And in a posthumously published paper, he indicated that the type of reforms, the welfare state, the nationalization of industries, and so forth, would have enabled, to some degree, full employment to be reached. Unfortunately, he wrote this, but it was not only unfortunate it was published posthumously, but also he published it as that golden age of capitalism was coming towards an end, and those fundamental reforms were being undermined. So I think his approach to the securing of full employment is that we need, with the technical solutions, that is getting demand right, but also we need some fundamental reforms in terms of the way that the capitalist economy overall worked. And whilst that, to some extent, did have some effects during the 1960s, 1960s, the last, 40, 50 years now have rather reversed that, and we've, on the whole, had substantial years of unemployment after that.
Malcolm, thank you very much. I'm just going to throw in a last question. I don't want to put you on the spot, but I think it's an important one. How relevant is Kalecki today? I mean, many of his writings are 50 years old and more. So how relevant, what can we take from Kalecki and apply it to the problems of today?
I think the importance of effective demand, I would say issues to do with what Kalecki would have termed the degree of monopoly, but that whole power relationship between capital and labor and how that has changed through recently rising concentration again, but also through the processes of financialization. And a number of my colleagues have applied ideas about the degree of monopoly to look at financialization and its effect on profits. Others have looked at what I think comes out of essentially out of Kalecki or evolved into distinction between so-called wage-led and profit-led regimes. What are the factors which overall lead to whether wages or profits have more effect upon demand? So those sort of issues. I think it's also the case that, as with all macroeconomics, and indeed I think all monetary economics, is written against a particular set of institutional arrangements, so that there are parts of it which clearly have to be changed to reflect the changes in the institutional arrangements. So that in a number of places, Kalecki wrote of the constraints which balance of payments would place upon the achievement of full employment and expansion. And obviously, we now live in a much more globalized economy even than was the case when Kalecki was writing. So we have to extend that work in terms of the international economism, which of course many people have done. But I still see the essential ideas of the role of effective demand and investment, the roles of the degree of monopoly, and the other general aspects of the economies in which we live that Kalecki will soon carry forward. But we always have to be updating particularly the institutional arrangements within which it operates.
Okay, well, Malcolm, thank you very much. Very interesting. I could go on and on about talking about Kalecki. Thank you very much, and hope you're well and stay safe.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.